I just kept building my record. That night, I printed everything again. I organized the notices. I wrote a clean summary of events so far. I saved backups. I even drafted a brief statement that summarized my position in calm, non-emotional language, requesting authority, offering neutral verification, refusing unauthorized entry. Because if this turned into a hearing or an internal dispute, I wanted my version to read like the only reasonable one. And right before I went to bed, I received one more message. This one wasn't from management. It was from the board. The tone had changed completely. The confidence was still there, but now it had a sharper edge. They said they would arrive to conduct the inspection. They said they expected full cooperation. They said the situation would be documented. They didn't explicitly say they'd force entry. They didn't have to. The implication was enough. I stared at the screen, and for the first time all day, I felt genuine anger. Not because they wanted attic access. Because they were treating my home like a stage for their power trip. And in that moment, I made a decision. If they showed up, they weren't just going to face me. They were going to face a process they couldn't bully. I spent the next hour setting up what I needed. No drama. No traps. Just preparation. Phone charged. Folder by the door. Timeline updated. Security camera storage checked. And one more thing. I scheduled the neutral inspector for the earliest slot I could get the next morning, because I wanted to be able to truthfully say I'd already taken action to verify the situation. I wanted the board's demand to look unnecessary even to someone reading it cold. Around this point, the pressure of the deadline came back again, heavier than before. The board wanted me to feel like I was running out of time, like I had to choose between privacy and punishment. But my brain kept circling one thought. If they were truly confident in their authority, they would have cited it already. People with real authority don't hide their paperwork. Only people with bluff power do. Morning came fast. I woke up with that weird mix of dread and focus, like I was about to walk into a meeting I didn't ask for. The first thing I did was check for any new messages. There was one. A short email from the HOA, repeating the demand and repeating the claim of authority, again without any citation. 24 hours. I looked at the timestamp. They were counting from the original notice, not from their latest message. They wanted the clock to keep running no matter what they changed. I added it to the timeline and exhaled slowly. Then I saw a new notification from management. They still hadn't confirmed the authority. They were still seeking clarification. That was the second crack. Because if management couldn't confirm the authority in time, then the board's 24 hours demand was just a countdown to nothing. Unless they were planning to escalate in another way. And as I stood there, staring at my phone, I heard something outside. A car door closing. Then another. I stepped to the window and saw them. Not a crowd, but enough to make the point. 2 board members, and a person I didn't recognize holding a clipboard like it was a badge. They were walking up my driveway. And for a split second, I could feel the old instinct trying to rise. The instinct to panic, to rush, to open the door and argue like a normal person. But I wasn't dealing with normal people. I was dealing with a board that thrived on pressure. So I picked up my folder, started recording, and moved toward the door. Because whatever happened next was going to define the boundary between my home and their power. And if I handled it wrong, they'd take that boundary forever. I reached for the doorknob as their footsteps hit the porch, and my phone buzzed one more time. Inspection demand. HOA orders attic access today 24 hours. The HOA claims emergency authority and demands intrusive compliance in 24 hours, so he requests the exact rule citation, records every interaction, and lines up neutral verification to challenge their shifting justifications. My phone buzzed right as their footsteps stopped on my porch, and for a second I thought it was just another reminder from the board, another vague sentence stuffed with authority they couldn't prove. It wasn't. It was the neutral inspector confirming the early slot again, with a simple note. On the way, please ensure attic access is available for inspection. That one line tightened everything into focus. Because I wasn't the one refusing access. I was the one controlling access responsibly. I had verification scheduled. I had documentation organized. I had requested the rule citation multiple times. And they were still showing up with a clipboard like my roof belonged to them. I opened the door just enough to step outside, keeping the boundary clear without turning it into a scene. I didn't smile. I didn't glare. I just stood there with my folder in hand and my phone recording in plain sight. The board members were exactly what you'd expect. Serious faces, practiced posture, the calm confidence of people who think rules are weapons. The clipboard person looked like an outside contractor, but there was nothing neutral about the way they positioned themselves behind the board, like backup. The HOA president wasn't there, and that was the first interesting choice. They'd sent lieutenants, people who could provoke without taking the blame. They started with the same claim: emergency authority, attic access, deadline, compliance. I didn't argue. I didn't react to the tone. I simply asked for the exact governing document section that gave them interior entry rights under the circumstances, and I asked for a written statement describing the emergency condition they believed existed. They didn't have it. They tried to redirect with vague language about maintenance provisions and protecting the community. They leaned into the idea that I was being difficult. They implied that refusal would be noted. I didn't interrupt. I let them talk because when people are improvising authority, they always talk too much. Then I repeated the same 2 points again, slower. Exact rule citation. Written emergency description. One of them insisted they didn't need to provide that on the spot. That was all I needed. I told them, calmly, that I had already contacted the management company to verify their claim, and management was still seeking clarification. I offered my alternative again. A neutral inspector was scheduled and would provide a written summary of attic conditions. I would share that summary promptly. They immediately rejected it again. They said neutral verification wasn't acceptable. And that response told me everything. Because if it was truly about safety, neutral verification would have been the best possible outcome for them. It would have proven the attic was fine or confirmed a problem without creating liability for the HOA. Instead, they wanted access. They wanted the power of walking into my home. So I pivoted to the part they weren't expecting: procedure. I asked if they had a board vote authorizing forced interior entry. I asked for the meeting record or agenda excerpt. I asked whether the person with the clipboard was insured and authorized under any contract with the association. I asked for their name and role. They refused to answer directly. They tried to reduce everything to a single narrative: I was obstructing an emergency inspection. That word again. Emergency. But the more they said it, the flimsier it sounded. I flipped open my folder and showed them a printed copy of their original notice and my written requests for the rule citation. I didn't shove it in anyone's face. I held it like an exhibit. Then I showed them the management email stating they were still seeking clarification on authority language. I watched the board members exchange a quick look. That's the moment when petty power games turn into panic. Because now there was proof that their own management company hadn't backed their claim yet. They pushed anyway. They insisted I had to comply. They suggested they could document my refusal and proceed with enforcement. I nodded once, as if I was considering it, and then I said something that shifted the whole dynamic. I told them they were welcome to document that I was cooperating with neutral verification and that I had requested the exact rule citation multiple times without receiving it. I also told them I would not permit entry without written authority and that any further demands needed to be in writing through management. Then I stepped slightly to the side, not an invitation, but to show I was ending the porch interaction without slamming anything. They didn't leave. Instead, the clipboard person took a step forward, as if preparing to move past me. That was the first real escalation, and it wasn't loud, but it was aggressive in a way that made my skin crawl. The board members weren't just threatening paperwork anymore, they were testing physical boundaries. I held my ground. I kept my voice low and even. I pointed to the door and the threshold and repeated that they did not have permission to enter. I didn't shove. I didn't raise my hands. I just stated the boundary and kept recording. The clipboard person paused, then stepped back, irritated. One board member muttered something about non-compliance and consequences in that tone designed to make you feel like you've committed a crime by refusing a favor. I let them say it. Then I asked one more question that made them flinch. I asked whether this alleged emergency had been reported to any relevant authority, or whether it existed only as an HOA demand. They didn't answer. They couldn't, because it was theater. At that point, they realized they weren't going to get the attic. So they changed tactics. They went for social shame. They started talking a little louder, not yelling, but loud enough that anyone walking by might hear. They framed the situation like I was refusing a safety inspection. They implied I was putting neighbors at risk. They made it sound like they were brave volunteers trying to protect the community while I was the selfish homeowner standing in the way. It was calculated, and it almost would have worked if I hadn't prepared. I responded the same way again. Neutral verification scheduled. Written summary available. Exact rule citation requested. No entry without written authority. Then I ended it. I went inside, closed the door, and locked it. The porch fell silent for a moment, then I heard footsteps retreating. I watched through the window as they walked back to their cars. The clipboard person looked annoyed. The board members looked angry. And as they drove away, I knew the next phase was coming. Because in HOA conflict, the first battle is access. When they fail at access, they retaliate on paper. The neutral inspector arrived later that morning. I let them into the house because this person wasn't the HOA. This was the entire point: neutral verification, clean process. They went up, checked the attic conditions, and did what neutral professionals do. They looked for actual issues, not for reasons to punish. When they came down, their face told me more than their words did. Nothing urgent. Nothing dangerous. No emergency. They said they'd produce a short written summary confirming there was no visible hazard that warranted emergency intervention, and they'd include photos of the general conditions as supporting evidence. I felt relief, but it wasn't victory yet. Because I knew the HOA wasn't going to accept a neutral report that undermined their narrative. Sure enough, later that afternoon, I received the retaliation. A new notice. Not about the attic. About something else. They claimed I had violated inspection cooperation requirements. They said my refusal to grant access constituted non-compliance. They said the matter would be escalated. No mention of the neutral inspection. No acknowledgement of my offer. No reference to management being unable to confirm authority. Just a rewrite of reality. They demanded, I refused, they punished. It was classic homeowners association drama. If the facts don't support you, ignore them and keep writing. I saved it. Screenshot. Print. Timeline. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The notice included a new justification for the attic demand. A different one than before. Now they claimed they'd received reports of a condition that could affect the community. No details. No proof. Just the implication that there was a bigger issue and I was obstructing the solution. Shifting justifications again. And the deadline was still referenced, 24 hours. They were clinging to that number like it would make their authority real through repetition. That was the moment I realized they weren't going to stop. Not until they were embarrassed. And not in a dramatic way. In a documented, procedural way that made it impossible for them to keep pretending. So I started building the trap. First, I forwarded the new notice to management and asked them to confirm whether the association had authority to demand interior entry under the claimed circumstances. I attached the neutral inspector's upcoming report confirmation and stated that a neutral inspection had already occurred. Then I asked a second question. If the HOA believed there was an emergency affecting the community, why had they not provided any written description of the alleged hazard, and why were they refusing neutral verification? Those were liability questions. Managers hate liability questions. And that's why I knew the management company would respond differently now. This wasn't just a homeowner complaining. This was a homeowner documenting contradictions. While I waited, the HOA escalated in a different way. I noticed a vehicle slowly driving by my house twice in the same hour. Not stopping but lingering. Then, a few minutes later, someone walked near my yard with a phone held in that "I'm totally not recording" angle. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't wave. I simply saved the security footage. Because retaliation isn't always a new notice. Sometimes it's the subtle pressure of surveillance, the kind that makes you want to retreat and comply just to make it stop. But I wasn't going to retreat. If anything, the petty escalation just confirmed the board's goal wasn't safety. It was dominance. Later that evening, I received a message from management, and it was the first time anyone on their side sounded nervous. They said they had reviewed my communications. They said they were concerned about the board's handling of the inspection demand. They said that interior entry requests required specific conditions and proper documentation, and they had not yet seen documentation supporting the board's emergency authority claim. They also asked for the neutral inspector's summary once available. That was it. The first official admission that the board's demand was shaky. I read it twice and felt the balance shift. The HOA board had tried to corner me with a 24 hours deadline, but management was now questioning the board instead. Now it was the board that needed paperwork. But I wasn't done. Because management's concern wasn't enough. If the board felt threatened, they'd try to cover themselves by creating a new narrative and burying the contradiction under more paperwork. So I took the next step in the trap. I requested the association's records. Not all records, not in a dramatic way. A simple written request for the specific documents supporting the alleged emergency, any reports, complaints, board votes, or inspection findings that justified the demand for attic access. And I asked for the association's policy on interior entry, as written. I kept the tone professional. I stayed in the lane of procedure. Because in a petty revenge HOA story, the most satisfying revenge isn't loud. It's watching them drown in the paperwork they weaponized. The next day, the neutral inspector's written summary arrived. It was clean, direct. It stated there was no visible hazard that warranted emergency intervention. It noted general conditions were typical. It included photos that showed nothing dramatic. I forwarded it to management. Then, because I knew the board would try to ignore it, I also sent a copy to the HOA board through the official channel, with a short message stating that neutral verification had been completed and that I remained willing to cooperate with legitimate concerns once proper authority documentation was provided. Again, not refusing. Cooperating responsibly. That message mattered. It removed their ability to paint me as uncooperative. Within hours, I got the board's response. They dismissed the neutral report. They claimed it was insufficient. They claimed they still required direct access. They claimed the matter would be placed on the agenda for enforcement action. That was their mistake. Because they had just committed, in writing, to rejecting neutral verification without providing any legitimate basis. They were openly admitting it was about access, not safety. And now I had a plan. The HOA loved meetings. They loved agendas. They loved the theater of official proceedings. They loved to sit behind a table and speak like judges. So I was going to let them. I was going to let them put this on an agenda, because once something is on an agenda, it becomes a record. And once it becomes a record, contradictions become permanent. And if there's one thing a controlling HOA hates, it's being pinned to their own words. Management sent out the agenda excerpt a day later, and I saved it immediately. Evidence prop number 4. The agenda excerpt included a vague line about inspection refusal enforcement. No details. Just enough to signal they intended to use the meeting as a pressure tactic. I prepared the same way I always did. Timeline, printed exhibits, and a short written summary of events. But I also prepared something else. A question list. Not confrontational questions. Procedural questions. The kind that sound reasonable to anyone listening, but force the board to either answer honestly or reveal their dishonesty. Questions like, what exact governing document section authorizes forced interior entry in a detached home? What documented emergency report supports the demand? Why was neutral verification rejected? Why did management state they had not seen supporting documentation? Who authorized the clipboard person to attempt entry? Each question was a trap, because the board couldn't answer without admitting one of three things. They had no authority, they had no evidence, or they were acting outside proper procedure. The day of the meeting arrived, and I walked in with my folder. Not dramatic, not angry, just prepared. The board sat at the front, doing their usual performance of seriousness. And when my item came up, the HOA president finally showed up, leaning into the narrative like it was already written. They framed me as obstructive. They framed the attic issue as urgent. They framed my refusal as a threat to community safety. No mention of the neutral report. No mention of management questioning authority. No mention of their shifting explanations. Just the story they wanted the neighborhood to believe. That's when I began, calmly, with my first procedural question. I asked them to read aloud the exact governing document section that allowed them to demand interior attic access within 24 hours. The room went quiet. They didn't have it. They tried to summarize. They tried to paraphrase. They tried to refer to General Maintenance Authority. I waited. Then I repeated the request, exact section. Read it. They couldn't. So I moved to the second question, and I did it in a way that sounded even calmer. I asked whether the board had any documented emergency report, complaint, or professional findings supporting the urgent attic access demand. And if so, whether they could provide it to management and include it in the meeting record. They tried to pivot again. They said they had reports. I asked if those reports were written. They said the information was sensitive. I asked if they could at least confirm whether management had seen it. And that's when management's representative, who had been sitting off to the side quietly, shifted in their chair. You could feel the tension. Because if management denied having seen it, the board's narrative would crumble in front of everyone. The HOA president tried to cut it off, insisting the board had authority and the homeowner was obstructing. So I went to the third question, the one that made it impossible to keep pretending. I asked why the board rejected neutral verification that confirmed no emergency hazard, and why they still demanded direct access. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I simply asked. A neighbor in the audience, someone I'd never spoken to, made a small sound of surprise. Not loud, but enough to signal people were paying attention now. Because neutral verification is what reasonable people want. Only unreasonable people reject it.